Good evening. Can the four of you hear me? Yeah, okay. Is there any way to get a view of the Zendo from the front so I'm not looking down at you guys? No. There. So thank you for joining for this evening's basic Buddhist teachings. This should be really fun. On top of giving a talk in a room by myself. Um, I didn't get a chance to ask Soka-san what he'd like me to talk about tonight. And not that I couldn't draw on something to talk about, but I guess I'd like to just come back to the basic aspect of what we're doing here. It really isn't complicated. When we meet together to talk about the teachings or ask questions about the teachings, it should be very simple in the sense that finding a way that the teachings are not some abstract um, content, or they're not some philosophical ramblings that we can just marinate in, but the way in which the Buddha's teachings are applicable to our lives. That there's actually a way that these teachings can help us look at how to relate to our world. And so that's what we've been doing over the last few years with basic Buddhist teachings. We're looking at the original teachings of the Buddha out of the Pali Canon. We've looked at Mahayana teachings. We've looked at some Vajrayana teachings. But that's what it comes down to, is how we can use these teachings to support our living a life in a world that seems so disjointed in such a way that we bring at least we don't bring more chaos into it. Ideally we bring a little bit of sanity into it, a little bit of kindness into it. So tonight, it might be a fairly short talk, but I'd be really curious, all of you, most of you have been joining for quite some time. You're practitioners, you're sitting on a near daily basis, probably you're participating in talks, you're participating in book studies. And I would like to just see what kind of questions there may be about what it is about this path that is applicable to our lives, how we can relate to the teachings to help us understand more deeply what is arising in front of us, as opposed to covering up what is arising in front of us with Buddhism or meditation. So we're actually using those concepts to create or look at intimacy, as opposed to create a more distinguished identity. So any questions that might be showing up this evening? Go ahead, you now. Humor me.
You definitely. It seems like even with a few years of meditation, and a lot of practice, that I should say, I still want to cover up. I still want to escape. It it seems like it's almost more painful to be so aware that what I'm doing. Um, is there, I, the question comes up about progress, and I know it said there's no progress in meditation, no progress on the path. But is there anything that will keep us looking at these things when we feel discouraged about that? Bowing.
Each one of us is going to have to find that inspiration for ourselves. The roundabout way of doing it is leaving and seeing that what you thought you could get rid of by leaving the path continues to follow you. So maybe Buddhism, maybe meditation actually does expose some raw nerves. And so we say, well, I don't want to do this. This is too painful. So we walk away and we get enamored with other hobbies and things we're doing. But eventually we see that that raw nerve hasn't been cured. It's not gone anywhere. We were able to avoid it for a while. So I think a lot of us probably did a lot of that back and forth before coming to the path. So we see, well, it didn't work to do X, Y, and Z to relate to my negativity, but there's something about understanding it through seeing it directly that resonates. That being said, any one of us may find practices that are resonant. I don't know. I'm sure any one of you could list something you've read that inspired you. Listening to Sokuzan's talks. There's something that I've worked with personally called the Sevenfold Mahayana Puja, which is a practice, a devotional practice of creating appreciation and dedicating yourself to the path. And so there's different ways to work with that. It's very difficult. It's very difficult when meditation actually begins to deconstruct itself on the path, that we can't even prop ourselves up with Buddhism anymore, and we're left with just that raw edge of facing the negativity that is arising for us. Further questions?
Aren't you bowing?
Yes.
Moving away from the monastery has seemed to make my life more compartmentalized. Is there some sort of inherent ignorance that comes from that kind of situation? Bowing.
No, I don't think so. And I think Buddhism historically shows us the incredible diversity of ways of approaching the path. That some people commit themselves to strict monasticism or strict asceticism, and others are um, householders. And I think if the intention is there, we can use whatever is arising as the path. So that very tension that you may experience because there's a standard of how you were doing it and the way you're doing it now, I think there's a lot to be seen just in that tension that's created of, oh, I felt like I was a better practitioner, I was a more dedicated or devoted practitioner. So I would just encourage you to go into the qualities of disappointment that may show up or failure, however you would characterize it. And for any one of us, that it's not that we don't feel a compartmentalization of our practice, that when you join on Zoom, it feels like, oh, I'm really connecting, or you're getting into some sitting on a regular basis. But um, that tension is really valuable. There's nothing that you can't relate to as an aspect of the path.
Aren't you bowing? What does the tension show us? Bowing.
The way that looks to me is that what tension shows us is positions, that it's really difficult to have tension without 2 points that seem to be opposed to one another that create some sort of pulling. So we've known each other for a really long time, and we've known each other really well for a really long time, and you've always been just really good at doing things. Like, you're just really good at stuff, and you complete it, and you're like the best at everything. And you disagree with me, I'm sure, but in college, that was like a lot of what you did as a RA, as a student ambassador. You were always at the front. And so here you have a project you can't succeed at, Buddhism, the path. So there's this tension of every aspect of my life. I've been able to exert myself in such a way where I'm recognized as somebody who's able to do this really well. And the path often doesn't provide us with that. And so that's what tension shows to me, is somewhat of the standards we maintain and how we would like to apply the standards we have for the rest of our life to a situation that we can't really even see too clearly, which is the practice of meditation and this path we're traversing together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions?
Navi bowing.
Yes.
Trungpa Rinpoche talks about hopelessness in the book, Crazy Wisdom. I was wondering, what's your thought about hopelessness in relation to the enlightenment?
think it's a really strong word, and I'd be curious to hear how it resonated with you. You know, hopelessness is sometimes talked about in the context of bodhicitta. And I think that the hopelessness is seeing that there's no final destination. You're not waiting for something to occur. You're not trying to push something to fruition. So when we start to relate to the path in such a way where we're just kind of having to be with what is arising, to the ego, that feels hopeless because we aren't getting, similarly to what I was saying to Junshu, we're not getting the type of acknowledgement we're used to. And I would say that it reminds me a little bit of also like the idea of loneliness and aloneness, that hopelessness, like loneliness, still may have a sense of wanting something else. But um, a word that resonates for me is somewhat is relief, when we see that we don't really have to accomplish anything. We actually could just live our lives. And that's certainly not something I can claim to be doing, but something we extend ourselves into on a day-to-day basis, to just receive our life as it shows up. And it can be pretty dismal at times. Did that word strike you in any particular way when you were reading it?
Well, I'm not sure, but it actually gives me a good feeling. It's kind of liberating.
Good.
Um, um, I think to me, it's actually, like you said, it's liberating.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions this evening? Go ahead, Ondo.
Ondo bowing. Um, just kind of on the opposite of what Naveed was bringing up there, that hopelessness. I hear Sokazan from time to time talking about a sense of humor, get a sense of humor. How do we get a sense of humor?
I really genuinely do not know, because in the midst of what we are experiencing, if there is the type of claustrophobia that we have around it, it's hard to inject anything artificially. And if we do inject something, it's usually our projection of what it would be. So, if nothing else, I try to consider the disruption that that kind of statement creates for me. And it may be a disruption of resistance, it may be a disruption of wanting to be able to do that, because we all know it's not about making a joke out of what is happening, because that's quite distasteful. It's like, well, I'll just try to say something silly. That's my a defense mechanism I have and others have, is to say something funny to lighten the mood. And I don't think that's what's being pointed at with humor. And so when we receive an instruction like that, to relate to it directly is to relate to whatever shows up, as opposed to relate to a fruition of what we're trying to create in that situation. So it may be that things just have to be very tense or very warlike, but at least we have an opportunity to see the war, because we see that there's nothing humorous. We feel no humor. So maybe there's another way we could look at this, or maybe we could look at it a little bit more closely. I'm still trying to understand what fundamental humor is. And I've heard it talked about as spaciousness. And I think we represent or imitate that space when we hold the body still through meditation. That there's something very spacious about sitting, even if the mind feels very claustrophobic, because we're not just looking at the mind, we're including all the sense fields. So that is my returning point, is to just continue to return to that form of imitating or expressing spaciousness through the body and sitting still.
Ondo bowing, it seems like when Sokazan says that he's basically saying invite a sense of humor or invite spaciousness. What is invite in that? I mean, do you have a sense of what invite could be when that's the last thing like you're saying, tenseness, or like
You
Naveed
could
was using the word hopelessness, bowing.
look at practice like alternating sense awareness. So if we're inviting something in, that is not uncommon. That when something hooks us that heavily, it becomes very, it's like you've got blinders on. All you see is that one object of opposition, at one point of discomfort. And so by acknowledging the sense fields, again, it's not going to necessarily diminish the negativity, but at least it gives you a moment, a flash to acknowledge that in the midst of this warfare, there's still a room around me and there's still feet underneath me or my bottom underneath me. There's still, as you'll hear, we're on a road that's quite trafficked. So there's still traffic coming by. And I think for me, coming back to where I started the talk is how do we take these teachings and actually apply them to what we're doing? There has to be some application to what we're doing, to having an intimacy with what is arising. And I just can't overemphasize for me how important it is to find space to practice, to have an intimate experience of consciousness that is not limited to progress. Because there are times where there's no way we're going to figure out the world. We're not going to figure out the opposition, but there's something that we can do in taking our seat, just holding still and to reduce the production through sitting.
Hondo bowing, I hate to keep on throwing Sokuzan sayings,
Please do.
but
I told everyone it could be a very short talk. These ones where you're a bit isolated, and so yeah, if you've got questions, be happy to respond.
yeah, so what was coming up for me there was what? Um, oh, you're not that important. So, it's again, an invitation to not take ourselves so seriously or whatever's showing up so seriously. Uh, what does that bring up for you, bowing?
Actually, really love that teaching, and it has personally been helpful at times. I'm very results oriented. I'm very practical. I can see relatively what's happening and execute well. And so sometimes when something starts to derail, I want to re-rail it, and it ignores the vastness of the causes and conditions that allow anything to happen. So if any of you were to just contemplate one aspect of your day where you tried to make something work, or one aspect of your week, or one aspect this month where you really tried to make something work, there may have been some relative success, but I guarantee at some point you find something that there was no way you were going to reroute that you realize for yourself that you're not that important because you can't save democracy. That doesn't mean we don't try. And so when that comes up, it's often wanting to modify someone else's experience. And so Kazan reminds me you're not that important. It's not even yours to be interfering with. So I think it returns me to receiving. When other people have heard it does sound a bit abrupt, sounds a bit demeaning, but I think it has a realistic quality that allows us to slow down and look a little bit closer. Thank you. Really appreciate your questions.
Milka bowing.
Yes, Milka.
Oftentimes we come to the path with a lot of dirt or clutter or weightiness in our lives, and we think we're going to figure something out. What is it that's happening that keeps us coming back when we don't figure things out? Bowing.
Actually, I feel like I've been thinking about this a little bit lately, and I don't know if any one of us really could pin down what that is. I feel like there's almost a seed of bodhicitta that is sparked just in coming to the path. It may not be very clear. It's not meaning that we're able to act for the benefit of others in everything that we do. But that insistence on returning when we do not get the results we're expecting, that we fight and fight and fight, and yet we come back and we yell and yell and yell, and we come back and we, have whatever outflows. The coming back isn't always based on something we can recognize. And so I think that something has resonated in such a way that brings us back over and over. And oftentimes, to me, it's associated with just the experience of suffering. That's a pretty powerful and oftentimes non-conceptual experience that motivates us, and we see some value in beginning to relate to the suffering directly, as opposed to trying to relate to an antidote.
Kabali, do you have a favorite antidote? Bowing.
I find there are several, but for me at this point, there's something about sitting. I can't sit enough. And as some of you know, I'm stepping back from some of my responsibilities with Sokuzan's support to maybe spend the next 6 months trying to get back up to 25, 30 hours of sitting a week. It's not an antidote, but there's something that I just am very certain about it. There are other times I mentioned the sevenfold Mahayana Puja. You start out with prostrations, you prostrate your body to the altar. You make offerings of tea and incense. The third one is probably the most triggering, which is often called a confession, but you would make an acknowledgement that through our confusion and through the expression of body, speech, and mind, we've caused trouble for others and ourselves. You then rejoice in the qualities of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and the teacher. You ask them to continue to teach, to turn the wheel of the Dharma. The sixth is asking them to remain for the benefit of others. And finally, you dedicate the merit. So it's a very formal gesture and expression where you start out by just offering your body, offering incense. You acknowledge you need help. You ask for the help and acknowledge that there are beings that can give you this help. And then you finally just say, now let everyone have that. So that's a form that I've found supportive. I think you can read about it in Trungpa Rinpoche's. There's like a 3-volume collection. There's the individual path of liberation, and there's the Bodhisattva and the Vajrayana. I think it's in that second volume.
Kabali, you mentioned something about, I don't know, it was the third or fourth one, which is rejoicing. What can we rejoice on the path as a practice?
There's a little bit of creation here. There's a little bit of creativity, which is not uncommon. But you could rejoice in the idea that somebody has awakened to their true nature, and that that's available to everybody. You can rejoice in the qualities of the teacher. You can rejoice in the qualities of the bodhisattvas who are able to live their lives for the benefit of others. So you're really trying to cultivate this idea that this is not this isn't just like a story. It's not something we tell ourselves. It's not a fable or folklore, that we acknowledge the living qualities of Buddha, which are available to us, and that we are grateful that we could even receive such teachings as this. It's hard to rejoice in content. Sometimes it's hard to rejoice in our experience. But I don't know if I've met anyone that regrets having come across a path that says that you are the Buddha. You can see this for yourself. It's quite moving and not always so common in the world. I really appreciate, I feel like there's a lot of people with their cameras on tonight, and I just wanted to say I appreciate seeing you all. It's a bit lonely. I mean, I'm not lonely. I've got Senshu and Rumi, but I just appreciate seeing all of you tonight. Other questions this evening? Go ahead, Jishin.
Jishin Bowing. The practice of confession, which you just described, it it's somehow dear to my heart. I have from the tradition of Catholicism from the past, and then other practices which were similar. That practice has a deep meaning for me. But I'm wondering to whom do you confess when you confess within the framework of Buddhism? Bowing.
In a sense, I could say you're acknowledging it just to yourself, or you're just acknowledging it for anyone who is able to hear. I mean, not going out on the street corner, not like actually having to verbalize it, although you may. And in Shanti Deva's The Way of the Bodhisattva, there's an entire chapter, maybe chapter 2 or 3, is on confession, and you'll find that in the Jukai ceremony, which you went through, we start out early on with the Gata of Atonement, which, all ancient wrong action ever created by me since of old, etc. That's directly from Shanti Deva's Bodhicharyavatara. And so I think that it's just trying to take that mindset that we need help. We would like help. We're asking for help. And what are we asking for help with? The fact that we continue to take our prejudice and relate to it in such a way that we fight with ourselves and fight with others. I would just say that in reading those, you can just have a sense of, if you can get the essence, it may be important, because some of them read very much as a very Old Testament shaming attitude, and that's not at all what we're trying to do. It's an acknowledgement. It's just a very simple acknowledgement that today I was sharp with sensu because I was frazzled about dinner. You're not pleading for anything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions this evening? Anyone that's joined regularly but has never wanted to ask anything and feels like tonight's the night?
Myoka Bowing, you, in response to rejoicing, you mentioned living qualities. What are the living qualities, or what would you say about that?
The living qualities would be the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The living qualities would be the direct, warm breath that shares the teachings with us. Those are living qualities. And since this is basic Buddhist teachings and we do talk about some of those different structures, there's one that could talk a little bit about, which would be this idea of the Trikaya, the 3 bodies. First is the Nirmanakaya, and then the Sambhogakaya and the Dharmakaya. And as practitioners, the Nirmanakaya would be the most easy to recognize. This is the physical body, the actual human expression of the teachings, which for most of us would be Sokuzan. And you have the Sambhogakaya, which we could rejoice in, which is when we actually hear the teachings, not just as concepts, but in that way that inspires us to continue to return. You could say there's something about the returning that's related to the Sambhogakaya. And the final would be the Dharmakaya, which is the ultimate body, which is without form and without characteristics. Sometimes the 4th bodies mention the Svabhavakaya, which is the self-existing body, which encompasses all, that there's only one singular body, which is expressing all 3 perfectly. But so what are we rejoicing in? We could just rejoice in the fact that we're not just having to read this from a book and try to decipher it for ourselves, but that there's actually somebody, Sokuzan, who's able to bring life to the teachings. Could rejoice in the retreat hut too. That's what I often rejoice in. There's something about that. There's that you actually have something that you can do on a daily basis that is more than just like a faith or belief. Not to say that those are incorrect or that they don't have a place on the path, but there's something so powerful about having something that you can do. And I think that's part of what drew me to Buddhism, was that I can do this for myself every day. I don't have to go to a special place. Um, so I would rejoice in that sort of practice that's available wherever we find ourselves. Ondo, did you have a question?
This is Ondo bowing. This kind of starts or sends us in a whole nother direction, but I was thinking of earlier today how if we can't get to the wall, can the wall come to us? And I'm thinking of people who are struggling with pain, in particular, chronic pain. Can the wall come to us? Bowing.
Yes. Yes, I think I really like when Sokuzan talks about flashing on something. So when we are unable to get to the cushion to just acknowledge our practice, that may be through flashing on senses. It may be through just saying, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. It may be, you could literally just pause for one half of a breath, so to the point where no one would notice it. But I think anything to disrupt the apparent continuity of everything, the continuity of the body, the apparent continuity of the thoughts and the stories, but to actually pause and just flash on what that is. So I would say yes. And any one of us has been through periods of time where sitting is not something we have access to regularly. And I don't think that that removes us from the path at all. So intention, as Sokuzan talks about, um, is pretty powerful in that respect.
Ondo bowing. So to go a little bit farther with that, can the pain itself, if chronic pain is what's keeping you, or something's happening with your body and it's just keeping you from sitting. When you think of the wall is something that we look at. Can chronic pain be something that we look at, to watch for movement, to observe what's whatever is showing up, bowing?
Say yes, and to just be considerate of becoming a martyr to that pain. I broke a vertebrae in my back about 12, 13 years ago. And so I was so desperate at one point, I was looking at experimental surgeries in Texas. Probably the last thing I needed to be doing. So what I was able to start looking at for me was how entwined, how enmeshed my narrative of pain was with the actual physical experience of pain, and seeing that when I began to look at those, how sometimes the emotional qualities of chronic pain at times became more powerful than the physical pain, because it comes with so much fear and anxiety, and you just become so tired because of the pain. So I think just like anything else, if we can flash on that and look at the story we tell ourselves or the story we tell others, again, it's not incorrect, because the fact is we may be in tremendous pain. But I think we can utilize that or relate to that as an awareness practice. As with anything, though, I want to come back to not overdoing it, because there can also get to be this aggressive mentality that somehow we need to have an objective experience of pain, and so therefore we're just going to muscle through it, and that also doesn't help. So Sokuzan's always encouraged me to do what I can and then take care of myself. So there are times where I sit and I'm in a lot of pain, and there are times where I just go and take some Advil and lay on a heat pad for a while. So, yes, it can be a part of the path. Any other questions this evening? So go ahead, Jishin.
Jishin bowing. I have another question about confession.
Yes.
To me, it is in whatever form it is. I mean, I'm talking about the one which I practiced. It feels quite powerful. On the other hand, and it kind of operates on the deep level. On the other hand, my question is about: am I reinforcing the illusion? Am I reinforcing the ego? You mentioned shame, and shame doesn't have to be a part of it, but it can have a color of, or colors close to shame. So, so my question is how to use the practice, which can have a deep impact, and without reinforcing the illusion. Bowing.
The only way I can really say to do that is to do it in the context of your relationship with Sokuzan or with the teacher. Anything. There's no aspect of the path that can't be utilized to reinforce a self. There's no aspect of phenomena that the ego can't get a hold of and spin it to say you're real. So it's really the context in which we relate to these forms that can help create a disruption when we're unable to do so for ourselves. So if it's something you want to practice regularly on a daily basis or a weekly basis or somehow outside of when it might be done formally, I would say doing it in the context of the relationship to the teacher is the best way to have a clearer understanding of how you're relating to it. And it also is a way to create a little bit of a check on if we start to get too indulgent about it or start to get too much satisfaction, positive or negative satisfaction from relating to it. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's the way that shows up, is to bring it into the context of the total relationship to the teacher, the teachings, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just once more, I think we can close for tonight. I really sincerely appreciate all of you so much for your questions. It really means a lot that you would share your practice with me in such an intimate way. I am so grateful to see so many of you tonight. And even those I can't see, I'm still incredibly grateful. I know there are a lot of things going on, but to just join in is much appreciated. And so we can go ahead and dedicate the merit, and thank you again.
May the merit of this penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Jiho san chi shi bu, shi song bu sa mo ko sa, mo ko ja ho ro mi. The 10 directions, the 3 times, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna, Paramita. O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect Sokokoji Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.
Are you feeling? Are you
I'm
feeling better,
better.
Chiezan? Okay, good.
Yeah, yeah, I'm feeling
I didn't
better.
know when to ask this question, but you look better than on Wednesday, so it's great.
That's good to hear. Thank you.